Skeptics of Western democracy have argued that Western democracy contributes to Africa's underdevelopment, with poverty persisting despite the adoption of multi-party elections and democracy in Africa since the 1990s. As the world's oldest democracy, that is the United States, prepares to elect its 47th president, we must ask ourselves, what is the relevance of American democracy to African democracy? Yes, I hear a lot of people asking this question. But at Beyond Africa, we take the view that African democracy must regard and watch American democracy with a lot of interest. Today, we're going to delve into this critical discussion with Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, a leading expert in U.S.-Africa relations and a proponent of a strong and democratic Africa. He's been working on democracy in Africa for over 30 years. So join us as we explore these pressing issues and the implications for the future of Africa. At the end of this conversation, you should go home knowing at least what the American elections hold as importance for Africa, why Africans should watch American elections with interest, and where African democracy is going to. Is it sliding? Is it on stagnation? Or is it improving? Africans need leaders who can govern, who can bring the continent forward. And thus, we believe at Beyond Africa that the people's voice must be considered. The people's voices are important in the shaping of their destiny. It was the Romans who said, Vox Populi, Vox Dei, meaning the voice of the people is the voice of God. So public participation is a critical element in democracy. And when we come back, I'll present Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh to you.
Welcome to Beyond Africa. Subscribe, like, and share our content. That's the best way to support us.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome back to Beyond Africa. So now I present my guest to you. Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh is a primary and very well-recognized figure in the Africa-USA relations, and he's championed democracy, good governance, and human rights in Africa. For a long time, he has been the Africa Associate at the National Democratic Institute, but now he's a senior advocate and a senior advisor to the president of the same institution. If you do not know, he was born in Cameroon and has worked with these institutions in the United States and has been prominent amongst the voices that have communicated with African politicians, African presidents about democracy on the continent. He has visited, spoken to, and negotiated democracy, good governance, and human rights advancements in almost all African countries. So let us listen to this program and enjoy the conversation with Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be on your platform and to contribute to the conversations about our continent, its past, its present, and its future.
Thank you so much for accepting to come. I know you've been very busy over the last 2 or 3 months. I've been running after you, and work has been calling you from one continent to the other, from one part of the United States to the other, and finally here we are. And we are talking about Africa, a continent you hold so dear to your heart. Can you just tell us a little bit about why you love this continent so much?
First, it's my continent of birth. It's also the continent from which I would like to say humanity originated. It is the continent of 1.4 billion people. It's projected that in the next 20 or 30 years, Africa will contribute to 25% of the world's population. It's a continent that's rich in mineral resources and human capital. It's a continent that has so much to offer, and to which many of us hold very dearly. Interestingly also, it's a continent that for various reasons at various points in the history of mankind has had its sons and daughters scattered all over the world. We are the only human race, that's got a diaspora that's found on every continent on the surface of the earth. So Africa, for me, is unique, and it has a pivotal role to play in the future of the globe. And that's why I feel very passionate about it, because I see the challenges, but I also see a lot of opportunities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chris. Ladies and gentlemen, you're on Beyond Africa, and on Beyond Africa, we explore how Africa's diaspora can contribute in transforming the continent. And Beyond Africa considers Africans at home and abroad as the key catalyst to the transformation of the continent. And Dr. Chris, you just said that you are so passionate about this continent. And when we look at most people who've traveled out of the continent, it appears they don't care much about the continent and its transformation. Do you share that view that Africans who are abroad do not think or do not work hard towards the transformation of the continent?
No, I do not share that view. I can understand the hard feelings that have driven many Africans, especially the Africans of our generation, of our times, who are moving out of the continent, not because they're forced, as was the case with those that crossed the continent in ships because of the slave trade at the time. The Africans of today are leaving their continent, some to pursue education and to acquire new skills, others because the circumstances within their respective countries make it extremely difficult for them to make a contribution, and they therefore feel the need to go out and seek for greener pastures. But I can also tell you that deep down to a person, each one of those Africans is attached to the homeland. Each one of those Africans, if given the opportunity, would strive to make a difference, to make their countries or the continent a better place. And this is very proven. For example, in very concrete terms, when you look at the financial remittances that Africans send to the continent on a yearly basis, and this is documented by the World Bank in its multiple reports on migration and development. For 2023 alone, the remittances of Africans towards the continent or into the continent accounted for $100 billion US. 100 billion US dollars is more than all of overall development assistance that Africa receives from developed countries. It's more than the private investment combined that the continent receives. So the diaspora alone is a key constituency that's contributing to the development of the continent, and that's only coming about because Africans in the diaspora hold very dearly to the well-being of the continent and to its future. I would also say, even historically and politically, when you think about the pro-independence movements across the continent, you will come to the realization that many Africans at the time, in the 50s and in the 60s, some of whom were serving in European institutions, such as Seda Senghor of Senegal or Fomunyoh of Cote d'Ivoire, others who were studying in the United States, such as Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, and many others were already advocating. They were joining their brothers and sisters on their continent to advocate for independence of the continent. And many of them made such strong contributions because they believed in the continent. And I think that thread still flows, that blood still flows in our veins. And I think that if the opportunities were to arise, that every African that's in the diaspora would find a way either to relocate or to make a meaningful contribution to the development of their country and the continent as a whole.
Thank you. That is brilliantly put. And Beyond Africa understands that Africans who are abroad are physically abroad, but spiritually at home because they want to contribute to make home a better place. And the mantra of Beyond Africa is provide a platform for people, for Africans, the friends of Africa, to talk about transforming their continent. So this is that platform where we invite everybody who has an idea and wants to transform the continent to do so. as you rightly said, our predecessors worked for the political independence of the continent from colonization. It is therefore our responsibility to work towards the economic and financial independence of Africa. We can do that. We have the resources, we have the networks, we have the intelligence, and of course, there is the money to put together and see how to transform the continent. If we could reorientate the remittances you just mentioned in another way that could spike transformation, processing, industrial transformation and processing back on the continent, I think the continent can transform because we need to generate that income on the continent. And one last word on this. I understand you are going to be speaking at a conference known as Rebranding Africa. Could you tell us more about that?
Indeed, I will. And before talking about the rebranding conference that's coming up in Brussels in the next 10 days or so, let me just add to your point to say that another statistic that's out there that your listeners need to know or your viewers need to know is that the totality of the African diaspora is 350 million people. And I'm talking about the diaspora of all generations, but that identify with the African continent is 350 million people, which means that if it were a country of its own, it would be surpassed in population only by India and China. It would be way ahead of the population of the United States. That's very powerful. And so if you look at it in terms of expertise, economic empowerment, and you tell yourself that this constituency is putting $100 billion into the continent annually, you then ask yourself, shouldn't it be natural that they, if they were shareholders in a company and they were putting $100 billion US into that company every year, wouldn't it be natural that they also have a say in how that company is run or governed? And that's, the message that I would love for the diaspora to take to heart, that I would also love for our leaders on the continent to take to heart, because they have to create that enabling environment in which the African diaspora can feel comfortable enough to want to invest and have a permanent stake in the well-being of the continent and their respective countries. Interestingly, in just about 10 days, a number of us will be meeting in Brussels, Belgium, at the invitation of Mr. Thierry Hord, who is a Cameroonian, who has organized an initiative, who 10 years ago launched an initiative called Rebranding Africa Forum, because he got the sense that the continent was not being well branded on the global stage, and that it was important to create a platform that would stimulate conversations amongst African experts, not only to showcase their expertise, but also to be part of that conversation about the continent. And that if the continent was being discussed by African voices through African visions, then the rest of the world will be obliged to listen, and we could then impact how the continent is branded, how the continent is viewed, how the continent's opportunities are acknowledged, even while we discuss the challenges and how to deal with them. So I really look forward to this fascinating conference that's coming up in Brussels. And you could see from the invitation that a whole range of experts are being invited from the economic sector, from the healthcare sector, investors, private investors, even leaders from the continent, including entrepreneurs, heads of states, and heads of governments as well.
That is promising to be an interesting event, and would like to encourage Thierry and his team, and maybe have them here to talk about what they are putting together, so that most everybody would become aware of what they are doing for the continent. Thank you so much, and this sounds like an area that we need to explore more and talk about, because it looks like you have a lot of ideas, and you've been doing so much already on the continent, in Cameroon, Prayer Foundation, and other initiatives. So we need to talk about what we are doing and what others are doing to put the spotlight on Africans who are actually striving to change the continent. So we learn from the difficulties they're having, and the proposals. Maybe they will learn from others and see how to ameliorate the situation.
Indeed. And the beauty of today's communication platforms is that a lot can be done virtually. And that while the conference is taking place in Brussels, they also do acknowledge that the bulk of the African diaspora is based in the United States. It's very active, it's very dynamic, and that they could also be very active participants in that conversation, which is scheduled for October 17th through the 19th. Interestingly, just 2 weeks ago, I was invited by the Ivory Club of Tampa in Florida State, which is an organization of African experts in the diaspora that meet annually to find ways in which they can contribute to the development of the continent, while at the same time also making contributions to the African diaspora in the United States. I was invited as a keynote speaker at their conference, and I was amazed just by how many African diasporas there are, even in a city like Tampa, Florida, and how much they each to a person are committed in finding ways to bring their expertise to bear in the development of the continent. And I would say that the countries and the leaders that already recognize this talent pool, this pool of expertise, and that can tap into it, are well placed to contribute to the development of their country. And one example that comes to mind before we move on from this subject is that Jerry Rawlings in Ghana, it's a very concrete example. When Jerry Rawlings was president in Ghana, he decided that Ghana was going to open its doors to all African diaspora. And the message coming out of Ghana was that every member of the African diaspora who wanted to relocate to Ghana would be given Ghanaian nationality and would be given facilities to be able to invest in Ghana. And once that decision was taken, many Africans in the diaspora, including here in the United States, actually relocated in Ghana. Many of them constructed residences in Ghana. Many of them opened businesses. And that was a real boost to the economic development of Ghana. And you can see that today, Accra has become a major international airport. There are international flights from almost all European cities and 2 or 3 U.S. cities, Atlanta, New York, Washington, D.C., direct flights into Accra. And sometimes you have to get up early and book well in advance to have a seat. Because Jerry Rawlings and his government and the people of Ghana saw what they could gain from embracing the diaspora. They embraced it intelligently, created an enabling environment, and the diaspora responded. I understand that Benin Republic is now thinking through similar legislation that would also try to attract the diaspora in the Caribbean and in Latin American countries, many of whom trace their origins to Benin Republic. And so that thinking is changing. If the thinking about the importance, the capital role of the diaspora, the importance of the diaspora is changing, even right on the continent itself, and I think it's changing for good.
That is amazing. May the soul of J.J. Rawlings rest in peace. In addition to this piece of magnificent legislation and policy, he also revolutionized democracy in Ghana and actually handed over power after his second mandate freely and lived in the country like any ordinary citizen. And that is something that most Africans should actually admire and remember J.J. Rawlings for. And talking about J.J. Rawlings handing over power, let us switch now to talk about politics. Let us look at the American politics, which you've been in the middle of it over the years. And I have received former United States ambassadors on this platform, Ambassador Thibonage and Ambassador David Shin. Both of them have said that Africa does not appear significantly on the American foreign policy thoughts when candidates are discussing American foreign policy. Very few of them think about Africa. But you are one of those who have been in the United States for long, and you have accompany United States governments, both Republican governments and Democratic governments, to carry democracy of the continent forward. Do you think that in the absence of considering Africa as a key player in American foreign policy, Africa should actually pay attention to the American elections as it is ongoing?
Well, I have been very fortunate all these years to work for the National Democratic Institute, which is a non-profit, non-governmental organization that works to support and strengthen democracy worldwide. And because we're non-partisan and we're non-governmental, we receive support, bipartisan support from the U.S. Congress, and our activities are conducted irrespective of the administration that occupies the White House. And so whether it's a Democratic or Republican administration, they've always been supportive of our activities and have allowed us the leeway to conduct our activities the way that we're mandated through the Act of Congress that created the National Endowment for Democracy, and through the National Endowment for Democracy, the 4 core institutes, one of which is the National Democratic Institute. I also know very well the 2 ambassadors that you cross-reference, Ambassador Thibault Nash, who was former Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, and Ambassador Shin, who served as U.S. Ambassador in many countries on the African continent. And those 2 gentlemen epitomize the bulk of former U.S. policymakers who have worked on the African continent, who know the potential that the continent has, who know and understand the opportunities that exist on that continent, and who regret the fact that they would wish that Africa was prominent, was a priority for incoming U.S. administrations, especially during the campaign season. I share their concerns, but I also understand that oftentimes, as we see with most U.S. elections, the elections tend to be driven by domestic issues, domestic concerns, and that foreign policy scarcely features during the campaign season. And even when it features, sometimes it's overshadowed by the major crisis of the day. What's happening between Russia and Ukraine, or what's happening in the Middle East. And then when Africa is mentioned, it has to be maybe the major conflict that we see today in Sudan. But the key issue that all of us Africans in the diaspora should focus on is what happens when an administration has been elected and is now in office, or when members of Congress have been elected and are now sitting in Congress. How can we engage with them to make sure that at that point, whether Africa was discussed during the campaign or not, but once the administration is in place and Congress is back in session, how can these 2 institutions that are really key with regards in terms of U.S. policy, how can these 2 institutions prioritize U.S. relations with Africa in a way that allows the African people to feel that their issues are being addressed and that they and their countries are being treated in a manner that's respectful and deserving, and that allows the Africans who believe in democratic governance to be able to participate actively in the positive administration of their respective countries. Fortunately, thus far, democracy has been seen as embraced in a bipartisan manner. And when I look back over the years and over my time working for the Institute, I'm happy to say that the work that we've done on the African continent has received support from both sides. And my hope is that once the elections are over in November, whichever party or candidate wins those elections, that organizations working on the continent would continue to receive the support that they need to be able to partner with African Democrats to make sure that democracy can be consolidated and actually practiced across our continent.
Yeah, thank you so much. One thing that we look at when we do our analysis of the African continent? I'm sorry about that. One thing that we look at when we do the analysis of the African continent is the impact of American diplomacy towards the continent of Africa. Most people or most critics along the streets of Africa, or even on some media houses, are of the opinion that American foreign policy or Western foreign policy is a cultural play. The democracy and of the human rights that the West reaches is not necessarily what they are looking for. They say they're just trying to change the continent of Africa to follow Western dictates and maybe transform themselves into Westerners. They would rather prefer to have investments on the continent than democracy because Africans need food to eat. What would you say about that?
Well, I've never, worked for a government, let alone the U.S. government, so I can't speak for the U.S. government. But as someone who has been working in the democracy space, I would first want all of us to remember that democracy is not an American export. Democracy has got universal values that citizens embrace, and that when you go, even in our villages, in our districts, in regions, in provinces, across the continent, there are certain fundamental values that Africans aspire to, that Africans practice. They may not call them democracy, they may not embellish them, or they may not package them with the same level of terminology, but issues such as tolerance, mutual respect, even the way in which some of our societies are organized, where you have chiefs, traditional chiefs, but also who are surrounded by traditional councils, where the chief doesn't make decisions without consulting the councils, where the councils also, or the councillors, when they talk to ordinary citizens, take their demands to the chief. We without even the terminology, our societies are born democratic. We just have to make sure that we can harness those values and aggregate them to also practice them at the level of nation states. Because I think the reason why in some countries we find that struggle and that ambivalence with regards to democracy is this false interpretation that it's a Western concept, but also the fact that we bring our various traditional practices from the smaller units of villages or districts or regions into an agglomerate, which is the nation state, which is a combination of multiple traditional practices. And so you take a country such as Nigeria, and you have like 3 major ethnic groups that have different traditions. But once it's now come together as one nation state of Nigeria, how do you go through its traditional practices and harness those that are reinforcing and empowering, while leaving aside those that do not longer conform to today's modern nation state? So for me, democracy is not a foreign concept. And I think that we should start off our conversation by acknowledging that Africans are not waiting for Western countries to come tell them how to govern themselves democratically. African societies are democratic by nature. The aspiration to live in democratic societies is innate in our humanity. When South Africans were fighting to bring an end to apartheid, they didn't wait for the West to come tell them that apartheid was wrong. In fact, at the time, certain Western governments supported the apartheid regime. But South Africans knew that they wanted their freedom. They wanted a democratic, egalitarian society in which every South African's voice would count. And they went out and they fought for it. When our parents and grandparents fought for independence, In fact, they were fighting against Western powers because they understood that independence would give them the freedom to determine what they wanted to do, the freedom to become whoever they wanted to be, the freedom to govern themselves. And those are the elements that constitute real democratic governance. And so with these examples, I hope the message goes out from henceforth that democracy is not a Western concept, that we as human beings have born in us certain values to which we hold dearly, and that even across the African continent, our forefathers organized already in favor of these values, and it is incumbent upon us to fight for them, to make sure that the future generations don't have to fight the fights that we didn't fight, but also that we'll be leaving for the next generation a better, freer, more democratic Africa than the one that we may have inherited, an Africa that allows every human value to be recognized and treated seriously.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christopher, for that. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Chris. Sometimes we get Western governments sanctioning members of parliament or politicians in African countries whom they think do not abide with certain international norms. I think that is one of the reasons why people in Africa would argue that the West is imposing certain rules that they must abide by. If not, then they're not democratic. And this has often caused some tension between the concept of democracy, freedom, elections, between some African politicians and the West. But your expose or your reply to my previous question kind of sums it up by saying that democracy is inert in the African, but when it gets out of the local level, it needs to merge or it needs to adapt to certain realities out there. Is that what I'm hearing from what you're saying?
That's very correct. That's very correct. Because the nation state, and I think we don't talk about this enough. The African nation state is a modern creation. It's at independence in the 60s for most of the continent, early 70s for some. But this does not mean that African society didn't exist prior to the nation state. And I think what we're struggling with across the continent is this transition from the traditional societies that have existed since the beginning of mankind, in which certain norms and values were understood and accepted by everybody in their small communities, to how we function and regulate ourselves as a nation state, where authority now is no longer solely in the hands of the village chief or the district chief, but mandated into the hands of people at the national level, and how they, in putting in place the new frameworks, whether it's constitutions or election laws or laws on land property, land law, in putting in place those new frameworks, how do they do so in a way that allows Africans to feel that they have equal voice to how issues of national importance are determined? I think that's what we're really struggling with across the continent. But for me, the debate about democracy being inborn in all of us, it's real as anything. And the examples that I shared with you kind of buttress my conviction that these are not foreign concepts. They probably may just be interpreted differently based on a country experiences and the context in which a number of nation states try to exist today.
Thank you. Let's look at the current situation in the United States with the election, with the current ongoing campaigns between Trump and Kamala Harris. It seems like this is a very tense election, or the situation of the political situation in the United States appears to be tense. What do you make of that and its relations to Africa? Because most of the times, Africans look up to America as that older democracy from which they can learn what democracy is all about in an agglomeration of a modern state?
Well, that's a fair observation. And in fact, in the past 3 decades, the approach that we've taken to the work that we do across the continent, and I should say it's not just across Africa. NDI has got offices in 60 countries around the world. And so we're constantly working with partners from political parties and civil society organizations, from elected institutions like parliaments and local councils across the globe. And the approach that we take to our work is not coming in and saying, you have to follow the US model or you have to follow the UK model. When we work with our partners, basically the conversations are, this is how other countries have dealt with the issues that you're grappling with. And so look at this menu and see what it is that you can draw or what lessons you can draw from that experience that will be beneficial for you. And so the conversations about elections, political parties, campaigns, the role of the media, this is how other countries have dealt with those kinds of issues. And for me, that explains why a number of Africans take interest in U.S. elections. It is not because they intend to copy word for word what transpires with U.S. elections. It's more it's more for them to see the interplay of the actors and the institutions, and then see how relevant that could be for their own context. And in looking at the current elections, although we do not get involved in domestic politics, I would say that many people are looking at the process through which candidates are nominated by their political parties. Many people look at the party conventions and how it is during that period that parties put forward their platforms, the platforms on which they'll be campaigning. Many people are looking at the way in which the media is covering the campaigns, the opportunities that are given to candidates on a fair basis in terms of media coverage, and the fact that the media has the possibility to organize candidate debates so that candidates could be on the same platform and take questions from journalists. Those are the kinds of issues that African Democrats and Democrats on other continents as well are looking at when they look at U.S. elections. We recently organized a program around the convention because NDI, the National Democratic Institute, has a sister organization called the International Republican Institute. And our two institutes are usually called upon by the two main parties of the United States to help manage the participation of international visitors and international personalities around the party conventions. And so we invite party leaders from around the globe, a good percentage of them of whom come from the African continent, to come watch the convention. And in the course of the day, we organize workshops, we organize panel conversations, we organize opportunities for them to meet the campaign teams of the two major candidates, to meet some of the analysts on U.S. campaigns. And then in the evening, they have accreditation to be able to go into the convention center and just watch that. And many of them have told me that it is such a rich experience because it gives them an opportunity to see firsthand how the U.S. electoral process functions. So democracy support and democracy strengthening is more about sharing experiences and sharing lessons learned than anything else. And many countries have used that to see what can work and what doesn't work in their own context and to formulate new opportunities that can enhance citizen participation and the conduct of inclusive, transparent, and peaceful elections in their own countries as well.
Yeah, that was quite detailed, and it's interesting to know that the both parties actually work in inviting other politicians from around the world to come see how the United States organizes the elections, and maybe also do these American politicians ask you what you have learned from abroad that they could adopt in the United States?
Oh, in fact, the exchanges are usually very enriching because when these international visitors come to the conventions around the programs that we conduct, we have panel conversations. And the panels are not just a one-way street where American experts talk to international political leaders. We also have panels that are run by some of these internationals who share their own experience and their own expectations. One of the panels that we had in the last International Leaders Forum was a panel of young women leaders, and we had a panelist from Senegal, a young lady who had run for president in Senegal. We had a woman from Burma. We had a woman even from Tibet that is a member of parliament in exile. And so these young women leaders were also sharing with the American audience what their expectations are, what their inspiration is to get into the politics of their own countries, what the challenges are, and the kinds of partnerships that could be formed globally to be able to strengthen their own efforts in the nascent democracies that their countries are today. I should also recall that globally, there is an association called the Community of Democracies, which is a global organization made of over 100 member states that are democratic, that meet regularly to exchange views on the challenges that democracy faces in various countries around the world. And for me as an African, it was a source of pride in 2000 when this Community of Democracy was launched to see that 2 African countries were in fact amongst the 5 or 6 countries that were considered founding members of the Community of Democracies. And these 5 or 6 countries included South Africa and Mali, which at the time under President Alpha Omar Konare was seen as one of the emerging democracies on the African continent and brought a lot of hope with it. So Mali and South Africa joined Poland and the United States to launch the Community of Democracies in 2000, which today continues to thrive as a global association of countries in which democracy is thriving.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. And I just wanted to find out from you, when you work with African leaders and talk to them about democracy, maybe sharing experiences from abroad, United States, France, and all the rest, what kind of challenges do they tell you that they face when they listen to some foreign leaders talk to them? Do they feel they are being paternalistic? Do they feel they're giving them instructions to execute in a particular way? If not, they will not fit in the community of nations?
That's a very interesting question. And that explains, I think, to some extent, why organizations such as ours are able to have this sometimes challenging and difficult conversations with African leaders in ways that may not be as difficult when they're talking to their peers on a bilateral basis from a government-to-government approach. I think over time, governments have come to see the approach that NDI and other organizations take to our work, the fact that we don't come in to lecture them on what needs to be done. We come in and work in partnership with civil society organizations in the country, with political parties in the country, and we share lessons and experiences that have worked elsewhere, leaving it to them to then figure out what best suits their circumstances. We, at the same time, do not hesitate to remind some of these leaders about what universal norms are and why it is important that for them to be taken seriously by the rest of the world, they too have to meet those international norms. For example, you may remember that not too long ago, or in many African countries, in fact, when I first started with the National Democratic Institute, there were only 4 African countries that were considered democratic. And those 4 countries were Senegal, the Gambia, Botswana, and Mauritius. But today, that's no longer the case. And as more and more countries became democratic, even the leaders began to see the benefit of meeting up with international standards. 2 or 3 decades ago, for example, in many countries, elections were being organized by the Minister of Interior. Today, that's no longer the case because many of these countries have seen that internationally, there's recognition that elections should be organized by an independent entity that is neutral vis-a-vis all of the political contestants. And they too have moved towards creating independent election commissions to organize elections. 2 or 3 decades ago, in many countries, citizens were not even accredited, were not even allowed to monitor their own elections. But today, domestic election monitoring, citizen observation is now the norm, and countries have moved to embrace that as well. That's why around elections, you see civil society in almost all African countries being accredited. You see civil society deploying thousands of observers, their own citizens, to monitor and report on their own electoral processes. This didn't used to happen before, but it's only happening now because even those leaders have come to acknowledge that that's where the international norms are. You'll be very interested to note that in 2005, NDI co-hosted with 17 African leaders an African Statesmen's Forum in Bamako, Mali. And this was an opportunity for us to sit down with 17 former heads of states who had contributed to democratic transitions in their own countries to talk about what the challenges for democracy were on the African continent, why transitions had worked in their own countries but were stagnating in other African countries, and what Africans and their partners, including organizations such as ours, could do more of to make sure that democracy could be consolidated on our continent. And we had around the table leaders such as Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia. We had Joachim Chissano of Mozambique. We had Jerry Rawlings of Ghana. We had President Nesofo Soglo of Benin. And it was such a rich conversation. We had Sir Kate Masiri of Botswana. And it was fascinating to see these African leaders sit together for 3-4 days with representatives from civil society and political parties and just talking about the state of democracy on our continent and how they have embraced this mode of governance with the realization that it is the best way to harness the values to which we hold dearly. It's the best form of government to be able to govern fairly and justly, and it's the best form of government that gives voice to citizens to be able to choose their leaders and to renew their mandates if they perform well, or to kick them out of office if they don't, and that it is in our collective interest to make sure that democracy can take root.
Thank you so much. I'm going to play 2 very brief videos, then we'll come back to the conversation. The first video is going to be in English, and the next one is going to be in French. And I think during the conversation, we would explain what the 2 videos are about, because they're talking almost about the same thing. So let's watch.
I don't know that I agree with you. To be fair, with all due respect, one doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work, and that's not what he did.
Les élections.
Pas Ouattara.
Pas Ouattara. Le Conseil des élections, nous savons qu'il les avait gagnées, comme Jean Ping les avait gagnées en 2016 à Libreville. Là, Gbagbo avait gagné les élections.
Pas Ouattara.
Pas Ouattara. Le Conseil constitutionnel a dit que c'était Laurent le vainqueur.
Vous connaissez la dispute, mais bon.
Ok,
passons.
Et le président Sarkozy me fait venir à l'Élysée et il me dit, il va falloir que tu appelles ton ami Gbagbo et que tu lui dises d'accepter de partir.
Welcome back, Doc. When you talk with the former African heads of state, do you come back? Do you hear them talking about this kind of stories? We hear John Bolton saying he has organized coup d'etat. We don't know that it's true or false, but there is suspicion on the continent that America contributes in the organization of coup d'etat. Then we hear Bougie saying that he was asked to tell the person who won the elections to leave. Do you hear from these former heads of state or current heads of state or politicians in general that they have this kind of pressure? Maybe as NGI, you go talk to them, and then there is some other form of pressure that is coming from the politicians in the background that you may not be aware of.
Well, first, I know Ambassador John Bolton. I had the opportunity to debate with him on PBS, but that was a couple of decades ago before he joined the administration of Bush 1 as Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. So that was a long time ago. But he's known to be very frank and open in his thinking. Given his age, I wouldn't be surprised if he's probably making references to things that may have transpired in the 70s and in the 80s, because that was quite another era. We all recognize that during the Cold War, the superpowers were propping various henchmen across the continent. The Soviet bloc had its friends and allies. The Western bloc had their friends and allies. And there was a lot of shenanigans at play in that era. However, in this third wave of democratization since the 90s, Africans have taken charge of their own countries. We have seen, for example, in Rwanda, President Kagame, and you can see Rwanda is a small country, but President Kagame walked out of the Francophonie and said Rwanda will no longer participate in the Francophonie. And nothing happened to Rwanda, nothing happened to him, and he's still governing his country. We've seen the heads of states who have their people's interests at heart and who have the courage and bravery to step forward have done so and have continued to govern. And my sense is that some of these relics of the past would have to come to terms with the fact that Africa has changed and that the generation of African leaders today is no longer the generation of the past. And also that African countries now look at multiple alternative possibilities of partnership and will not allow themselves to be dictated to by one individual or one country or one emissary on behalf of one foreign government or the other. And that for me is pretty enriching because when you talk about international relations today, there's not an African leader today, especially the leaders who know that they've been duly elected by their fellow citizens. There is no one of them who is going to say that they would abandon the interest, the national interest of their fellow citizens to satisfy one or two foreign leaders. That also underscores the importance of legitimate elections because leaders who derive their legitimacy from the ballot box by their citizens are more apt to hold their ground and stand firm even in the face of international and external pressure.
Thank you so much. There is one thing I asked, and I want to follow up on that. Have you had any former president or actual presidents come to you and say, what you're telling me is good, what you're telling me, you really want to do it? But yesterday, I got this call from France, from London, or from Washington, D.C., telling me that I must do A or B. If not, C or D is going to happen. Have you ever had such communication?
Well, in the early 90s, in the beginning, just in the years following the Cold War, some of those conversations used to come to the surface. But nowadays, those things are really conversations of the past. Because there's also a recognition internationally that Africans are tired of being talked down to, and that Africans want to have their say on matters that concern their interest. I would also say that in some cases, we have to acknowledge, as Africans, we have to acknowledge that some of those traditions had to do with countries that were more in the Francophone zone. where Paris still exerted a lot of influence on fiscal policy, monetary policy, and in many cases used to try to intercede on behalf of French-speaking countries or Francophone countries on matters of international relations at the UN and stuff like that. But I should say that today we're seeing that those relationships are no longer as patronizing as they used to be. And my sense is that many an African leader would hold their ground and draw the line in the sand if they were being compelled to do something which was really not in their national interest and not in the interest of their fellow citizens.
All right. Thank you. When you spoke about the invitation to international politicians to come attend the two congresses here, I played this image, this video that was running on the screen, and it reminds me of something that I wanted us to talk about, and that is what you tell African politicians before elections. You kind of explain to them, as you have already mentioned, the necessity for respecting the polls, respecting each other, respecting the outcome, respecting the law, and even giving room for observers. But most often, after the elections or during the elections, there is so much tension in the air. And I want to use a Nigerian example where the last election, presidential election, was so tense. Even on social media, we read a lot of tension. But then you have former Vice President Osinbajo and Peter Obi working together peacefully, amicably, conversing with you, smiling. But if you just go to social media, you will not see that relationship between their followers. What do they tell you that they tell their followers? Do they read social media and do they tell their followers to stop that?
Well, I think this is one example of the relevance of this saying that sometimes we get the leaders that we deserve, in the sense that we as citizens have the responsibility to be able to get our leaders to realize that elections are not a do-or-die affair. That as former President Goodluck Jonathan said very famously in Nigeria, no election is worth the blood of fellow citizens. And if we have healthy conversations on social media platforms, then it sends a very strong message to our leaders that their supporters expect them to be civil and respectful, and participate positively in the electoral process, knowing that it's a competition. And that really explains why it was heartwarming to welcome former Vice President Yemi Osinbajo, who is a member of the APC, and Peter Obi, who is a member of the Labour Party, who are competitors in the Nigerian political arena, who spend time in Chicago talking very freely and amicably with each other, and discussing how they could work, each contributing their quota to make sure that democracy could be strengthened, not just in Nigeria, but across the continent. In that Nigerian delegation, we also had the former Senate President, Senator Ken Nnamani, who used to be with the PDP and then later on with the APC. And it was just lovely to see them talking together. That's why as I said earlier, these exchanges, these opportunities for politicians to go out of their national boundaries, out of the zones in which they're in head-to-head competition, to sit down with politicians from other parts of the world, provides them an opportunity to broaden their vision or their scope and realize that you can have disagreements, but ultimately placing the interests of your fellow citizens and your country at the heart of everything you do is paramount to strengthening democratic spaces and democratic governance, and it contributes to making sure that the country can stay stable because citizens would have healthy engagements amongst themselves. There is still a lot of hope, even in Nigeria, that those two leaders and others that represent the younger generation of Nigerian politicians and civic leaders would continue to pave the way for this country, which is the giant of the African continent, to lead by example and actually show us and the rest of us that politicians can lose power, politicians can leave office, and still continue to make positive contribution to how their countries are governed.
Thank you so much. And that takes me to the next part of our conversation, which it's looking at are you of the opinion that democracy is sliding or stagnating on the African continent?
Well, I would be the first to say that there was an era in which we were all very optimistic and very hopeful and very enthusiastic. There was a lot of effervescence in the early 90s about the state of democracy in Africa. Namibia had just obtained its independence in 1989. Apartheid collapsed or was being dismantled in South Africa in 1991, 1992. Nelson Mandela came out of prison and was elected president of a free democratic South Africa in 1994. About 17 former military regimes in Africa collapsed or were sent back to the barracks between 1991 and 1994. And there was a lot of enthusiasm that democracy would continue to grow. In fact, at NDI, we had an in-house joke. We used to say, in the next 2-3 years, democracy will be all settled and we'll move on and do other things. And this was happening not just in Africa, but even around the world. The Berlin Wall came down. The Soviet Union collapsed. Poland and the Solidarity Movement and Les Wałęsa, they went from being protesters in the shipyards to running for office and winning the presidency in Poland. Les Wałęsa came out, Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia. And there was a lot of positive energy around democracy. And I think because of that, many Democrats around the world, including in Africa, went to sleep and took everything for granted. And we thought that the battle had been won. But unfortunately, in the past decade, we've seen a lot of backsliding. We've seen the emergence of military coups, something that we thought was now an idea of the past. We've seen even presidents that were democratically elected, once in office, unfortunately performing poorly and dismantling some of the institutions that got them into office. We've seen the whole debate about constitutionalism and the respect for presidential term limits. And we've now ended up in a very bad spot where the two longest serving presidents in the world are on the African continent, in the person of President Obiang Nguema of Equatorial Guinea, who has been in power for 45 years, and President Biya in Cameroon, who has been in power for 42 years. And so you cannot look at that mix and not feel the weight of the democratic backsliding that our continent has experienced in the past 5 to 10 years. At the same time, I remain hopeful because when organizations such as Afrobarometer and other African-led institutions conduct opinion polls of African citizens, those polls continue to demonstrate that well over 70% of Africans aspire to live in democratic societies. Well over 80% of Africans have a favorable view of democracy. At the same time, close to 50% of them are dissatisfied with the democracy that they see in their respective countries and are strongly putting out the statement that while the demand for democracy remains high on the African continent, its supply is weak and low and needs to be strengthened even more. That people want to see democracy deliver dividends. People want to see democracy improve their rights, improve their ability to aspire to higher office, improve their ability to live in a society that respects the rule of law, improve their ability to have their investments properly protected, and government public contracts issued with a lot of transparency and accountability. And so while the hopes are still very high, the rest of us need to work extremely hard to make sure that our leaders can deliver on the promise of democracy for Africans.
From our conversation so far, it appears to me, and maybe it's reasonable, that you feel very satisfied with the work you've done on the continent over the last 30 years, bringing, catalyzing, helping, and accompanying towards the improvement of democracy on the continent. Am I mistaken?
Well, there's a certain degree of satisfaction, but there's also a realization that the job is probably only just begun to be able to reverse the tide of the backsliding that we now see. But even more than satisfaction or dissatisfaction, there is a sense of pride within NDI in terms of the work that is being done by our African partners themselves. The work that is being done by pro-democracy activists who took to the streets in Benin, for example, and were able to bring down a military regime without firing a shot. The political and civic activists who launched the concept of national conferences that were very unique to the African experience in the sense that it created an opportunity for Africans from all walks of life to come together and take another opportunity to rewrite the constitutions of their respective countries to make them more open and able to respond to pluralistic societies. I take pride in the work that's being done by these Africans who put their lives on the line on a daily basis. The journalists, the civic activists, the human rights defenders and activists, the women leaders who are aspiring to run for public office so they can govern differently, they can govern justly. So it is they and them and their efforts that give me a source of hope that all is not lost and that the future is going to be brighter than what we may be going through at this point in time.
At this point, it sounds like you've mentored a lot of people who can fit in your shoes if you want to take a different role in public life.
That's correct to a certain extent. That's very heartwarming to hear, and thank you for the compliment. I feel that I can pinpoint examples of individuals that have gotten inspired by the work, by seeing me in action and the work that my colleagues and I have done across the continent. But I would also hasten to say that I personally have also been the beneficiary of a lot of wisdom from African leaders, many of whom embraced me as their own son or cousin or younger brother, and who also tutored me in terms of how to engage with other fellow citizens and how to communicate about the things that we think should be done in each of those countries. And there's not a day that goes by without me thinking about those mentors who have made of me who I am today. And for that, I will always eternally be grateful.
Thank you so much. And this mark of gratitude is what makes a person, is what makes an individual stand different when we look into society. You know, some people benefit, but they don't even think about that. And like I said at the beginning of this conversation, you're giving back to the continent. You're obsessed about the continent. And it's a mark of gratitude. And this reminds me, I think when your foundation was just started, at that time, I think I was a university student in Cameroon, and I was out on a vacation. Then my boss, Barry Sanchuno, he took us to the foundation's radio. And the journalists, at that time, the building was not yet painted, was not yet complete. So I just want to let you know that I was following this and that since from that time. There was one journalist there, she asked me very tough questions, and my boss always had to come in to intervene and build me up. And he's one of those also who have shaped me to what I am. And I think, recognition of what people are doing is very, very important. And I am very happy that you also pay gratitude to these African leaders who have helped you? Because generally when we hear about African leaders, mostly we hear complaints. We don't hear praises. We don't hear gratitude. And this is completely different. But before we move on, there is one person to whom you paid tribute over the week. And I would like to just maybe hear from you what you think about this person.
Wow. Well, what can I say about former President Jimmy Carter at 100? It's just watching, seeing the picture. You feel like all of a sudden you're in a different universe, because that is a true world leader, a leader who leads by example. And I just feel very fortunate. Very early on in my career, and you can see from the picture, I was still looking very young. I had a lot of hair and an afro hairdo, as we said at the time. Very early on in my career at the National Democratic Institute, I had the good fortune of being asked to go staff one of President Carter's trips to the continent. And later on, over the years, I had the real privilege, of serving with him as a former president, as he went monitoring elections across various countries on the African continent. I remember our experiences in Lagos, in Abuja, Nigeria, in Togo, in Benin Republic, in Liberia. And I cannot tell you how simple this former president has been in his post-presidency. I just cannot tell you. It's just things as simple as he always carried his own laptop. And in meetings, he would take his own notes. And he would go around as an election observer, and he'll be taking his own notes. I mean, that's humility at its best. I remember when General Eyadema was still the president of Togo, and we had to go from Togo to Benin Republic. The airport had been closed around the election period, and we had to go by land on roads which at the time were not yet paved. And we had a 4 or 5 car convoy. And President Carter was there with his wife, Rosalind Carter, former First Lady. And I was saying to myself, this is the former president of the most powerful nation on the surface of the earth. Why is he on this dusty African road with his wife, trying to be an advocate for inclusive and peaceful elections? And if he does that, then how much more of someone as myself, a son of the soil? So I gained a lot of inspiration from him, and we lit his candle for 100 years. We wish he could have 100 more, but he is a great human being. He's impacted millions of lives across the globe in his humanitarian work, in the work that he's done in his post-presidency, working on river blindness, working in the health area, working to enforce or strengthen democracy and good governance. I could go on forever about President Jimmy Carter. There's not another one like him. And I really wish him well as he's just celebrated his 100th birthday. And it's very telling that the good Lord has blessed him abundantly, and we continue to celebrate him as he looks on.
Thank you. I can feel the passion in your voice. I can actually feel it. And let's talk a little bit about, we should be rounding up, but I think we should have a few more minutes. But let's talk a little bit about the influence of China and Chinese spread into Africa and democracy. Do you think the Chinese bringing their own form of democracy, as they would call it, do you think it is influencing the development or the maturity or the emergence of democracy on the continent?
Yes, I think that it is. And I say this not to minimize everything that China has done with African countries. There are some areas in which you can point to infrastructure that's been developed by the Chinese. They can say they've built some roads, they've built some hospitals, they've built some football stadia, and that is to be commended. In countries that didn't have that infrastructure, that's quite beneficial. Nobody also wants to dictate to African countries who they can partner with and who they can trade with. The two things that are troublesome for me, one is to not do the same thing that China joined Africa in criticizing the colonial powers for doing. China came to Africa and said to Africans, we are brothers, we are friends. And the colonialists were bad. And of course, they were bad and they had their criticism. But the way in which the colonialists engaged Africa on the economic front was the direct exploitation of African resources, which were all transported for transformation in Western countries. And if China was critical of that endeavor, China should not at the same time use the same methodology to exploit African minerals for transformation in China. They should therefore not copy the same colonialist approach that they had been critical of. Because if you look at what China is doing in Africa, they're not building any industries in Africa for transformation. They're going after the same mines and mineral resources. They're exploiting them in a way that's not transparent. And they're carrying them all to help develop China. So there's some hypocrisy there that we should be courageous to pinpoint. And secondly, China is trying to peddle the narrative that you can have development without democracy. And they say, look at us. We are developed and we don't care about pluralism, political pluralism. But that's not right. You can't compare a country of 1.2 billion inhabitants to the small nation states that Africa has today with the kind of pluralistic, diverse societies that we have in each one of our countries. And we shouldn't be saying, on the one hand, one size doesn't fit all to African countries, so don't emulate democracy because it's foreign. But then we're giving you the Chinese size and it should fit you. And our size is, we don't want political pluralism. We're all homogeneous and we want everybody to bow to the Chinese Communist Party. That's just not right. And I think we should be calling them on that in as much as we appreciate their contributions to infrastructural development on the continent. The proof is that today, the Chinese Communist Party has opened a political party school in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, which means that even the Chinese recognize the necessity to raise awareness amongst political leaders. But they shouldn't do this in a way that is counterintuitive to the diversity and the desire for liberty and freedom that are inherent to every African and that we see and treasure daily on our continent.
Yeah, I received Ambassador Tibona Shia, as I said previously, and in our conversations, he said one difference between the Americans and the Chinese on the continent, and maybe that is one of the reasons for which some Africans are favoring the Chinese on the continent, is because the Chinese make deals and and Americans preach human rights and democracy. And that is one message that has cut across on the continent of Africa. And people tend to see the roads, the bridges, the football stadia, but they don't see the emergency humanitarian aid that the United States offers. So what is your take on that? Should the United States do more when it comes to business and investments?
Sure. The United States should do more, obviously. But people have to keep in mind that there's a difference in approach, that the United States doesn't have a United States Communist Party that dictates the government's policy. You know, that the United States is an open society that believes in liberal democracy and that believes in the private sector, and that there's a lot of private-public partnerships in which the United States is involved. That the United States also contributes tremendously to humanitarian issues. For example, in helping feed refugees and internationally displaced persons, like as we see presently coming out of the war in Sudan, where about 10 million Sudanese are now at risk of famine. And so when the United States does that, it doesn't have a way of capturing those images to say, see, we too are also doing humanitarian aid. Of course, we would like to see, even if it's through private-public partnerships, more investments in infrastructural development on the continent because there's that need. I grew up in a small village in Cameroon, and the first public building in my village in Cameroon was a health center constructed by the U.S. Peace Corps in 1962. And that building still is there till today. So there's ways in which the United States gets involved. It probably just doesn't do it the same way that the Chinese and the Chinese Communist Party does. The continent needs more. The challenges are out there. The opportunities are also out there. We would like to see both. We would like to see the Chinese invest in infrastructure, but at the same time, not put in place or not help put in place not opaque deals or not proper authoritarian regimes, because that undermines the people's ability to benefit even from the infrastructure that is constructed. So what does it serve? What purpose does it serve if you construct a stadium, but the construction of the stadium was done in such a non-transparent fashion that the stadium at the end of the day doesn't meet the standards of the World Soccer Federation or FIFA. And so the stadium is there, huge investment, but nobody plays on it and the government cannot recoup its money. But it looks beautiful on the outside. So accountability and transparency are important, even when you want to invest in development and infrastructure, because ultimately that's what is going to maximize the investments that even you, China, are making. And that would be the kind of conversation that I would have with the Chinese if I were to have a sit down with them to talk about their approach to the African continent. And by the way, they have to know they also should be reading these polls that are being put out by African organizations, just as Afrobarometer, that say that Africans want to be able to do both. They want to be able to eat, yes. They want to be able to drive on good roads, yes. But they also want to be able to have their rights and their freedoms and their ability to criticize their leaders and elect new leaders who they can hold accountable. Those things are not mutually exclusive when it comes to the African continent. And my hope going forward is that as superpowers, whether it's China or the United States or Russia or countries in the Middle East or India and Brazil and other countries that want to engage with the African continent, Japan, South Korea, they're most welcome. But they have to know that the African man and woman should be the centrality of focus and its totality, not just in terms of material needs, but also in terms of their rights and their ability to live in free societies and to maximize the talent, their God-given talent.
Thank you so much. I was going to follow up to ask about the funding of these organizations. Do you think that if a Chinese organization or if an African organization were funded by a Chinese donor to conduct such a study like the Afrobarometer does, do you think the results would come out saying that the United States is more favored than the Chinese?
No, I think that Africans are pretty independent in their thinking. For example, the new polls that have come out, conducted even by US-based organizations, that have shown that in a number of countries, the favorability, how Africans view countries, the favorability comparison between China and the United States has gone up in China's favor, and that 62% of Africans polled view China favorably compared to 60% for the United States. This is the first time that the United States has come after China, but it's also a wake-up call for U.S. policymakers. Rounding up where we started our conversation, it's also a wake-up call for them that they can no longer take Africa for granted, that this 1.4 billion people on this continent have a say and have opinions, and if they were to sway their opinion away from partnerships and relationships with the United States or other countries in the Western Hemisphere, that it could be detrimental for them in the long run on a whole host of issues. And so that's a wake-up call, but I think that's opinion. Those are findings that will be put out by Africans if they had the opportunity, irrespective of the funding that they receive. I am aware of the fact that the Chinese have been cultivating media outlets on the African continent, but that still does not prevent African journalists from being able to say things as they see them, especially with regards to the well-being of our people on the African continent.
Yeah, and there needs to be some sort of adjustments or trade-offs by the West, United States, for example. Most people view the Chinese favorably because they actually see the roads and the stadium and the dams that they are constructing in Africa. I think there needs to be an adjustment for the United States not to copy those projects, because some of them are white elephants, that is stadium that you used. They could actually promote the transformation of and processing of raw material on the continent and then export the finished goods. Look at the critical mineral market right now. If the United States encourages their companies to go in there, in the Congo, for example, and process the cobalt and export the resources, I think that's going to shape and change the mentality and the superpower fight on the continent.
An excellent point.
Something that India should be advocating for.
In fact, that's an excellent point, and a point that I think the African diaspora should take up. And we're wrapping up and coming back to where we started. Those are the kinds of issues that the African diaspora should be taking on head-on with the U.S. administration in terms of what they would like their priorities to be. And so there's a lot that could be done on the continent. The African diaspora needs to stay mobilized, and they need to be able to raise the kinds of issues that you just mentioned so beautifully in their engagement with Western capitals in terms of what the continent needs at this point. I mean, there are countries on the continent, such as Botswana, that are already well advanced in the processing of their own diamonds. And we've seen what that processing in country in Botswana has done to the economy of that country. There's no reason why the Democratic Republic of Congo shouldn't be awash with industries that transform its own raw materials, and so would be Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana and Cameroon when it comes to cocoa and other minerals. So would be Ghana, for example, when it comes even to gold. There's a lot on the continent that we can work with. I think the diaspora should be willing to step forward and add its voice to how other countries engage with the continent on issues of development, on issues of trade, industrialization, and the kind of expertise that even our own diaspora is ready to bring to the table, because it does possess that in abundance.
Yeah, and that is why we have this platform, so that we can talk about these things. We can explore the avenues that are available at the International Development Corporation in DC. We can explore the Millennium Opportunity or something. We can explore the the U.S. Exim Bank. What are the opportunities that we have? We, the diaspora, can explore that and take advantage of such. I would like us to wrap up, but we cannot wrap up without talking about Cameroon. So Cameroon has, there is this Anglophone, I don't know how you call it, Anglophone conflict, Anglophone crisis, Anglophone war, Amazonian war, Southern Cameroonian war. There are lots of denominations, but you can choose yours. This has been ongoing for the last 7 years. And what is your impression today?
Well, I've been very saddened by that conflict. I have lost relatives because of this conflict. From day one, my last public event on behalf of my foundation when I was at home on vacation was in Kumba in December of 2016. And at the time, we could already see that there was a lot of tension in the air. In 2013, 3 years prior, I had put out a little book on the Cameroon of tomorrow in which I had already hinted that I was getting a sense that there was a lot of restiveness in the Anglophone regions of the country about how Anglophones were being treated. And then we got into 2016, the tensions with the teachers and the lawyers, and into 2017, into full-blown shooting war. And it's been most unfortunate because my position from day one has always been, and a position that I shared openly on multiple platforms here as well as in Cameroon, was that the grievances are very legitimate. They are traceable. There's evidence to back up those grievances. They are legitimate grievances, and they're political grievances that must be addressed politically. And my belief is that from day one, from the get-go, if there was an understanding on the part of the government of Cameroon that these grievances needed to be tackled in detail, thoroughly, as a political issue, that we would have saved ourselves and the country the tragedy and the destruction that we've gone through in the past 7 years. It's absolutely tragic. And as we speak, I don't see an end in sight without a negotiated approach that would deal with the grievances that have been put on the table and that have now been amplified, even to the generations that have come of age in the past 7 years.
Yeah, and about last week or 2 weeks ago, one of the leaders, Ayaba Cho, was arrested in Norway, adding to the number of arrests of leaders that have been arrested internationally. Ayuk Tabe and his group were arrested in Nigeria. Some have been arrested and sentenced in the United States. Do you think that the international community is giving a wrong message? Because from your argument, it's a problem that is traceable, it is real, and can be resolved. So when the international community is kind of hitting hard on the separatists, do you think it's giving a wrong message to Cameroon?
Well, I think it is difficult to say, first, because I do not have all the details with regards to the issues for which not all, some of the leaders that you mentioned were arrested. Does this have to do with domestic laws in those countries? That would be quite a separate issue to look into. But I think that these arrests have also amplified the magnitude of this crisis in terms of raising awareness in the countries that you've cited to the fact that this crisis is ongoing and would have to be resolved one way or the other, or would have to be resolved through a negotiated process. My hope is that ultimately those negotiations are going to have to happen, that we're going to have to go down through verifying the root causes of this conflict, and that a holistic solution would have to be taken that would include freedom for people that have been arrested unduly or solely because of their advocacy on behalf of the people of what used to be West Cameroon or former British Southern Cameroon, or what some of our brothers and sisters call today Ambazonia.
Yeah, and one thing that we know in Africa is the elders always sit down and call everybody under the village tree to resolve the problem. And I'm looking at the conversation we had previously about the African Statesmen Initiative. Do you have any idea if they are putting their heads together to resolve or to cause their successors on the continent to talk? Because problems.
Well, I know for a fact. Yeah, I know for a fact because I've raised the issue with a number of senior African leaders. I know for a fact that a number of them were willing, if asked, to be able to step in and try to talk to all parties involved to make sure that cooler heads could prevail and a way out could be found. But obviously, it needs two to tango. And my sense was that many of those senior leaders didn't get the sense that their services would be appreciated or valued. But ultimately, we're going to have to seek recourse with leaders who can be fair-minded and who can take the time to sit down and walk everybody to the place that would find compromise and a way out of this crisis. That said, I must also hasten, and I've shared this with some diplomats, in a way of saying the sooner we can bring this crisis to an end, the better, because the generation that was active in the politics of the country at reunification in the 60s, that generation that had some moral sway, that could say in our African culture and African tradition, I am your uncle, I fought hard for this thing, I believed in it, so please, let's not break it. That generation, with people like late Cardinal Toomey, former Prime Minister Chidi Achu, the Monas, the Fonchas, the Fonmuketes, that generation, the Indelis, that generation is going. And the more that generation lives, the fewer people we're going to have that have any moral authority over the younger generation. So it is in our interest, it is in the interest of the government to take all steps possible. It is in our collective interest that this conflict be resolved sooner rather than later. Because if all of that generation goes, nobody's going to have the moral authority to speak to the younger generation. And then you have people who, in talking about the grievances, not only list the grievances as they were by 2016, but those grievances now exacerbated by the killings and destructions that have taken place in the past 7 years. And so that's really a clarion call that I put out there, and my appeal to everybody who is Cameroonian or a friend of Cameroon, for members of the diplomatic community and countries that see themselves as partners of Cameroon, that we have to do everything possible to bring this senseless war, this conflict to an end. And I hope that happens sooner rather than later.
Thank you. And we're talking about something that could easily move into another situation that could make it worse. Because as we all know, everybody has a shelf life, and we expire. It's natural. And Cameroon is at a point where the transition is mandatory. People are looking up to the transition. And do you think that the way things stand, if there is supposed to be some transition at this material moment, because the head of state bows out, do you think that could lead to another conflict in the country?
Well, it's not appropriate to speculate about things that are outside our control, beyond our control. But I would just say that whether the country stays on course or has to go through a transition, not resolving this conflict is only going to make matters more complicated for everybody. And so we have a collective vested interest in making sure that this conflict is brought to an end, and the sooner the better.
Thank you so much. And this definitely is my last question. I just feel like talking, but this definitely is my last question. We spoke about your impact, what you have already done to Africa, advancing democracy, mentoring others, and sharing in the lives of others to bring joy and prosperity to the continent. And that you have done that from a position of strength, from a position of your youth. Now, with all this experience that you have, in 2018, I read a lot of newspapers in Cameroon that said some people wanted you to be the president of the republic. Don't you think it's time for you to take that mantle to do the right, or to implement what you have been telling others to implement?
Well, thank you. I should have known that that last question would be quite sharp and thorough and personal. So You almost feel like wishing that the interview ended before the last question. But now that you've posted, first I should thank you for your compliments and your assessment. It's true that when many of our compatriots look at where the country is, they look around and they want to hope or wish that their best could, be by their side to help rebuild or reconstruct or rebuild. But, it's not a bridge that is on the table as we speak. I did say publicly in 2018, as the crisis was already ongoing, that I just couldn't see myself, ignoring the crisis as if people were not dying, as if villages were not being burned, as if internally displaced persons were not flooding the country. We're now close to 800,000 internally displaced persons, as if hundreds of thousands of refugees were not lingering around in other countries, just because, it was, to go out and say you are going into an electoral process. There are certain fundamentals that must be met. I think getting a sense that this crisis is going to be resolved is like a priority, should be a priority for everybody who loves that country and wants to see it go well. And for me, it would remain a priority. And once that is done, then, we can figure out the rest. But I'm really flattered by your thoughts and humbled by that as well. And I know that as you crisscross the globe, and I experienced this myself, I meet hundreds of thousands of Cameroonians, well-educated, very experienced, experts in their respective fields. There was a time we had Cameroonians working for NASA. We have Cameroonians in every field that you can imagine. And my sense is that the day that the country will create an enabling environment to request that all his sons and daughters step forward and make a contribution, that each one of us would find a way to make a contribution in the area of their expertise. And mine, having been in democracy and governance, I wouldn't hesitate one bit to make that happen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh. And that is the essence of Beyond Africa. We are working to sensitize ourselves to let the diaspora contribute to the development of the continent, and that we shall do. We shall continue doing that. And we encourage everyone to come to this platform and share their ideas, their experiences, and their expertise. We may be hiding somewhere and we don't know that you have some skills, but talk and share what you know so that we can spread that across the world so that everybody benefits from our expertise and our knowledge. Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, do you have any last word for our viewers?
Just to say thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. It's been a real pleasure spending time with you this evening and exchanging some views, or as my Nigerian brothers and sisters would say, rubbing minds over issues of importance to our continent. I would be glad to do this again. I hope that others of our brothers and sisters can be encouraged to also participate and have their voices heard so we can learn from each other and strengthen each other in the process. It's been a true delight, and I wish you lots of success with this new platform.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh. Thank you so much for coming. It's an honor to have received you, and you're busy. Please keep on being busy for the continent and for the people. God is going to bless you one day. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching this insightful conversation with Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh. I did not expect that this conversation was going to end. It kept on flowing. And as you saw for yourselves, Dr. Christopher is expertly knowledgeable on what he does, and he's willing to share. He's a very humble gentleman. So we pray on you to keep your comments in the comments section, and also share this video with your friends, family, and classmates. That is the energy that keeps us going. Send us what you think about the conversations. Tell us what you want us to talk about. Recommend viewers, and also recommend yourself to come talk on this platform. Thank you so much, and God bless you all.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to share this content and invite your friends to join us.